There are many situations in our life which cause us to be afraid and anxious. Even as I say that, I think some of you are probably thinking of them right now. The human brain is actually wired towards worry and looking for the worst. But one way of addressing that is to find a source of assurance, something that, or someone that you can trust that can answer the threats that you see. When we can rely on help, then faith overcomes fear. That's the promise of and the challenge of the gospel reading today. Just wondering if we might turn the volume down just a little. I'm hearing feedback in the system there. And later on when I start shouting, you'll regret it. In the account of the stilling of the storm, marks a turning point in the Gospel of Mark and how he tells the story. See, up until now, in the first 4 chapters of the Gospel of Mark, we've heard of Jesus' teaching, we've heard of his conflict with some of the groups of his day, his calling of various people to come and follow him, his casting out of evil spirits, and even a number of healing miracles. The disciples who were living that story, and the readers for whom it was originally recorded, have some idea of what Jesus was doing. But now, towards the end of this particular story, the question is not just what is Jesus doing, it is who is he to be doing these things? The precipitating crisis of the account is, of course, that there's one of those sudden, violent storms on the Sea of Galilee. In the low-walled fishing boat of the time, the waves are starting to spill into the boat. The disciples are in danger of being swamped and even drowned. This is more than just human illness. This is more than an indefinable evil spirit. This is the immense and crushing forces of nature against which there is no human defence, and even less so in those days than in ours. The disciples do everything they can, but it appears that it will not be enough. They wake Jesus, who incredibly is sleeping in the stern of the boat, and they say to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" It's easy to see the fear of the disciples. They think that they are on the verge of death. But can we also see here the anger of the disciples, as they now wake Jesus, not just to let him know about the situation, but also to accuse him of being uncaring about their fate? I don't know whether they even think Jesus can do any good. They seem to be waking him not in an attitude of faith, but actually in an attitude of angry despair. On the other hand, perhaps there is still something in them that says, well, if Jesus could heal people, at least maybe he could do something about this. At the very least, he could grab a bucket and bail with the rest of us. And isn't that so familiar to us as well? We too sometimes face situations that seem overwhelming and threatening, when we fear that we are going to go under, where we are going to drown under the weight of our troubles. And in those situations, don't we also sometimes act like the disciples? We hold on to some kind of vague hope that God can do something for us, but at the same time, we despair of his ability to do so, and even get angry with him that he doesn't seem to care about what's happening to us. But then for the disciples, something truly miraculous happened. Jesus got up, rebuked the wind and the waves, and they became completely calm. Although the disciples were despairing, there was an answer to their problem. But what an answer it was! They must have been completely surprised and even perhaps shocked. But then they have a new problem. Jesus turns to them and says, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" And it's at this moment then that the gospel writer tells us that the disciples were terrified. A literal translation of the Greek is, they were afraid with a great fear. Not just they were afraid, but they were afraid with fear, not just any old fear, but a great fear. The great squall goes away, and in its place now there is a great fear. And the reason for the fear is that something completely out of their expectations has happened. And sometimes that's still the way it is. We ask for God's help, but it is possible to get kind of a bit weirded out when it actually arrives. Spiritual directors are actually trained to look for this, to look for the fact that the normal human reaction to sensing evidence of the presence of God is to run away from it. And so in spiritual direction training, they warn you that when somebody has a great spiritual high and they become deeply emotionally convinced that God is present in their life, they're likely to run away from God and then have spiritual lows and kind of want to drop out of investigating any further. The immenseness and the holiness of God can be pretty intimidating to approach. And so even after a spiritual high, people naturally have spiritual lows because they came close to the fire of God and couldn't quite bear it. No wonder the disciples were afraid. The God that they thought they really believed in had shown up, and they don't know what to do with it. They are forced to ask each other, who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. But here we have arrived at the very point of why the Gospel of Mark records these events. This question of the disciples is the Gospel's point. Who is this? You know, in the very first line of the Gospel of Mark, Mark told us that this was the beginning of the good news of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. And along the way then, he's now given some evidence for that in the experience of the disciples. And of course, he's driving towards the final scene on the cross where the centurion will confess before the world, truly this man was the Son of God. But just at this point in the story, the disciples in their lived experience were not there yet. And even only 4 or 5 chapters into the Gospel of Mark, we as readers of Mark's Gospel may not be there yet. But Mark wants us to take the next step. And so he focuses our attention on this question, who is this? So that becomes the burning question as we read the Gospel, in the hope that we will come to that conclusion that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Who is this, that even the winds and the waves obey him? As difficult as it is to believe, the answer suggests itself. The book of Psalms kind of tells us the answer ahead of time. Psalm 104 verse 7 says, "At your rebuke the waters fled. At the sound of your thunder they took to flight." Psalm 89, "You rule over the surging sea. When its waves mount up, you still them." And of course, the psalm we read earlier today in our service, 107, "They cried out to the Lord in their distress. He brought them out of their distress. He stilled the storm to a whisper. The waves of the sea were hushed." Who calms storms? Who stills winds and waves? It's God, of course. Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? Can you think of an answer? The Gospel of Mark can. The disciples are not quite there yet, but their new reaction of amazement suggests that they are getting there. So what about us? For the original Gospel of Mark, this is the point of the story. It is to face the reader with the evidence that God is at work in Jesus in a unique way. He wants to lead us to the faith that Jesus is God's way of working in the world, The story, therefore, is about what Jesus did, but the meaning of the story is about who Jesus is. And it's that meaning that gives this story also meaning for us in our lives. Because who he was for the disciples is who he is for us. And that may change something of the way that we live and how we see the world. We too have storms in our life. They're not usually quite as literal as the one in today's Gospel, but they are nevertheless as real and as threatening. It may be the group of kids at school who niggle every time they see us. It might be our concern for our financial future. Health concerns often make us feel very much tossed about and out of control. That's nothing compared to the difficulties of raising kids, or putting up with parents, or being on the same page as our spouse, or caring for elderly parents, or worrying about your adult children, and caring, of course, for all our friends and neighbours who are also struggling with their own difficulties. Of course we have, like the disciples, also had experiences where God's power was at work for us. There are many times where we have prayed for deliverance and things have turned out okay. And that should be evidence to us that God cares for us and that we will be okay. But all too often, like the disciples, we forget those when trials come. It is easy to look at the wind and the waves and to feel overwhelmed and to cry out to God as if he were asleep and even, yes, to accuse him of being uncaring. Our fear so often leads to a lack of faith, and our lack of faith intensifies our fear. But this story in Mark invites us to examine the evidence and to ask the question, who is this? And it wants us to conclude that this is Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, through whom God is saving the world. This is Jesus who does care. This is Jesus who is in the boat with us. This is Jesus who can silence the winds and still the waves. And if we can hold on to that, it will change how we approach life. It may not be easy. The wind and the waves and the storms are real, and we do sense their power. Even when Jesus is finally acclaimed as the Son of God at the end of Mark's Gospel, remember that he is dying on the cross at that moment, or in fact has just died. God's final triumph looks like God's greatest defeat. And the disciples still had to wait through those days of suffering and grief to see what Jesus was actually doing. And so it's true that at times the power of God is not displayed in our lives the way that we would like it to be. But the conviction that this gospel story wants to make strong in us is that Jesus is capable and caring to look after us, and that we will weather the storm. But if that's the case, then the next question flows. Why are we so afraid? Do we still have no faith? In the end, the disciples questioned Jesus, but when Jesus was proved to be true, they in turn had to be questioned. As we travel through our tough times, are we failing to recognise the presence of Jesus with us? Are we failing to trust Jesus as we should? Do we fail to act boldly, knowing that God is able to provide for our needs and to take care of us no matter what happens? Being human as we are, there's so often that gap between knowing who this is and being fully able to trust and commit ourselves into his hands. Who Jesus is should lead to a change in our faith and therefore also address our fear. We can be sure that God is at work even in the storms of life. The commentator Strauss reminds us that St. Paul says that that he could delight even in weakness, because when he was fully dependent on God, that was when he was strong. We can be content in every circumstance because we can do all things through him who strengthens us. Trials are an opportunity for growth in character. Character leads to hope, and hope in Jesus Christ never fails. The writer of James tells us the storms of life lead to Christian maturity. St. Peter tells us that they prove the genuineness of our faith and that they will result in praise, glory, and honour when Jesus Christ is revealed. Strauss concludes we need to look at the storms of life not as disasters, but as opportunities to see God's transforming power at work in our lives. God can save us from the storms. God can even save us in the storms. And whatever happens, he will look after us. The wonderful thing is that even when our faith is not what it should be, Jesus Christ is always who he should be. He is who he is. When the disciples woke Jesus, they were miles away from the faith that they should have had. But that didn't matter because Jesus was there with them. And he saved them. Whether they believed it or not, whether we believe it or not, Jesus is the one whom the wind and the waves obey. God's grace is enough, and those things that are impossible with human beings are possible with God. How much more rewarding though it is, and how much more joyful it is when we recognise that. Our fear so often destroys our faith, and in doing so it takes away our joy. But how much more joyful we can be when we know who this is, and that even the wind and the waves obey him, and then our faith overcomes our fear. Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him? It is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. He was with the disciples, and it was good news, and it was life for them. He is with us, and that is good news, and that is freedom from fear, and that is life for us in every storm. Amen.